Thank you, Margaret Hamburg, for such an inspiring opening talk for this morning. As said, we will now have 4 short presentations of our panelists, without questions at their end, because we will have a panel just afterward. Our first panelist is Alexander Kagansky. He's a molecular biologist coming from Vladivostok in the far east of Russia. He's leading the Center for Genomic and Regenerative Medicine at the local university there. He's also a senior research fellow at Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. He regularly organizes public engagement of science activities for different target groups, including school students and general public. And for that, he's a great supporter of do-it-yourself biology, which bears, of course, a lot of ethical aspects. He will talk about this, but certainly not only. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to speak here. Thank you to all of you, and it was a great presentation before me. So this is a very exciting and nervous time for us, and I will try to ask the question if ethics influences science, but can science also influence ethics? We think that about ethics in different ways, and I think it is an ongoing process, and our current discoveries are affecting that. So in the Global Young Academy, we are trying to pose radical questions in these difficult times and try to understand how science can be better regulated and how we can bring these challenges of ethical debate to all of the public. How can we see and impose more justice in the world? So one of the working groups we have set is the do-it-yourself biology. So do-it-yourself biology is an example. So I'm a biologist, so I'll talk from biological perspective. This is to try to understand who is doing what in this time where you can clone human germline, where you can clone bacteria, plants, and so on. Basically, it is reasonably easy to set it up in the garage with some knowledge, and it is important what people think what they're doing. Sometimes non-professionals, they have more trust in science than scientists themselves. So we as scientists should try to bring the debate ongoing, and we also trying to do surveys. So if you can, please participate in these surveys, because we need more understanding of how people perceive DIY genetics, do-it-yourself genome technology. And the results we have that are preliminary are quite striking. Sometimes people think there's no need for governance. And I think this drive for achievement, like it was already noted with a Chinese researcher cloning babies, thinking that he brings the defense for the diseases. And if we think that we can create new versions of human that are defended from certain diseases, maybe we can even conceive the human that has less suffering, and how ethically we can promote it or defend ourselves from that. I think it is a very difficult problem, and it will be only cooperation and our desire to oversee it together and try to understand, should we do more, should we put more efforts into understanding how we can clone viruses that target particular populations of humans, we are going into this dual research of bioweapons. We should understand that this will not work, that whole human population will be endangered, and that is reasonably easy, and we all have to put a lot of thinking into how do we regulate, and how we raise our children, with what ideas, with what ethical concerns. And the other angle is even more important for myself. It's how biodiversity is endangered, how we lost more than half of all species as a result of our expansion, our technological progress. Sometimes from the molecular biology perspective, I think that current modern population can be compared to cancer cells. If we compare humans to apes, for example, that we now can use very extraordinary sources of energy and grow disproportionately in places where we couldn't think of. So we think that our discovery of our research on nature could help us formulate a more ethical agendas. As before, we embraced that other ethnicities have the same rights to live together with us. Now, I think we should work towards understanding that other animals and other species have equal rights to proliferate, and that there is molecular cooperation on the planet, that there are molecules in the species that are neglected at the moment that can help us survive and relieve our children and grandchildren from suffering if we try to be careful and prevent their extinction. So this working group that we've created is called Bio2Bio, Biodiversity for Survival via Biomedicine. So we try to screen chemicals that were for millions of years selected by nature for us, and we should try to use it for drug discovery and prevention of genocide of the species on the planet. So our intention is next year to build this global consortium. So please be part of it. Please let us have a global consortium with everyone on board, because it needs expertises from different areas of science. It needs traditional knowledge, it needs microbiology, it needs genetic engineering, and it needs the global exchange of ideas. So with that, I would like to finish my talk, but I think that by thinking into nature, by trying to understand the sea, the forest, and try to protect it from elimination of the forest, elimination of the species, could help us create ethical agendas. And the more science is going into this direction, the better chances we have for survival and for curing the diseases that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kagansky. We will make the most of Slido, and I asked each panelist of today's morning session to ask you a question, actually, and I'll now ask the next question to be set with Slido. And Mr. Kagansky is interested in knowing from you this question, and please again answer that question through Slido. Is taking biodiversity loss into consideration, do you think the human civilization will survive without wild species on the planet? So please, while I'm introducing the next speaker, answer this question, and we will come back to it during the panel discussion. Very good. So our next panelist today morning is Helena Nader. She's a biomedical scientist active on cell biology. She's a professor and head of the Institute of Pharmacology and Molecular Biology at the Federal University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. She has been a role model for many women in Brazilian universities, helping to promote the empowerment of women and breaking solid barriers in society. She is, amongst many titles, Vice President of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. And her contributions go beyond research, as she has contributed with initiatives aiming at diminishing the gap in scientific development between the different regions in Brazil, and also improving nationwide levels of high school education. Actually, that is why she will be talking about today with the big role of ethics in all this. Helena Nader, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Well, I decided I was going to read because I have a tendency to speak too much. So first, I would like to thank the organizers, the Hungarian Academy, to be here again, be in front of this fantastic audience. And I would like to thank you, Oliver, for the nice introduction. As my career in both the Brazilian Academy of Science and head of the Brazilian Society for the Advancement of Science, I had to be involved in discussions regarding science diplomacy, science advocacy, as well as science integrity. And I want to start quoting a recent paper published in 2016 by Garion Wolters from the University of Constance in Germany, entitled "The Limits of Science: An Analysis from Barriers to Confines." He states, "Scientific competence relates to the facts of the world and delivers descriptive results, while ethical competence relates to norms and values and delivers evaluative and normative results." In short, science tells us what there is, while ethics tell us what we should do or which things we should value. Regardless of the uniqueness of the professional activities, all people are subject to ethical principles. On the other hand, scientists, in addition to these ethical precepts, need to add rules of conduct that originate from the specific commitment of their profession, which are the collective construction and appropriation of science. These standards define the ethical integrity of the scientific activities and can be deduced from the fundamental principle of achieving the best contribution for the advancement of science. Any transgression of this principle, whether intentional or negligent, compromise the reliability of the results of scientific research, undermines the foundations of collaboration between researchers, and hinders the process of building science as a collective enterprise. Science should be an effective instrument for the expansion of human knowledge and the rational orientation of human actions in their most varied dimensions, and thus the lack of ethics undermines the public trust of science and undermines its own raison d'être. Academic freedom is guaranteed in most countries, and in several of those countries by law, such as their constitutions. Nevertheless, there are restrictions to what scientists can do in several countries, such as research using animal models and human beings. Also, there are restrictions for the application of science in some countries, like the use of GMOs. The scientific community worldwide has been particular interest and has dedicated continuous and systematic attention to different aspects of ethics in science and ethical integrity for the last 2 decades. It started here in Hungary 2 decades ago, the first discussion on science and ethics. The Singapore statement on research integrity represents, in my opinion, the first international effort to encourage the development of unified conduct. The statement was released for global use on September 22, 2010, at the Second World Conference on Research Integrity, with the participation at that time of only 51 countries. These include researchers, funders, representatives of research institutions such as universities and research publishers. The statement lists 14 responsibilities, that is, integrity, adherence to regulations, research methods, records, research findings, authorship, publication acknowledgement, peer review, conflict of interest, public communication, reporting irresponsible research practice, responding to irresponsible research practice, research environment, societal considerations. So, especially in the recent 10 years, in various parts of the world, regulations and codes of conduct, institutional policies have been formulated to address these issues, and institutional bodies are being set up. All of them have common principles encompassing the aspects of reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability, as recently restated in the revised European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. These principles have a direct impact on the results of research. Thus, publications comply with this ethical code and should be shared among all, independent of income, gender, region of the planet, and so on. Thus, my first question to this panel: are open access journals the answer for these demands? How developing countries can cope with the costs of publication on those journals? Non-open access journals cover their costs with subscriptions, site license, pay-per-view charges, as well as, for some journals, fees when submitting a paper for reviewing. Also, some open access journals have started disclosing the names of the peer reviewers when the process is finished. Is this the way to go regarding publications? Should we move to disclosing the name of the peer reviewers that analyze the papers, as well as on grant submissions and applications? There are two other points that I would like to raise. First, the advance of new technologies. We have been discussing that already, Dr. Hamburger Peggy, as well as, I don't know how to pronounce your name, the Young Academy from Russia did a fantastic talk on the topic. Nevertheless, I still want to mention something. The advance of new technologies in biology made it possible to produce GMOs for both agriculture and animal use. Nevertheless, some societies still mistrust the security of these procedures, both for the environment as well as human health. Where are we doing? We are not communicating right? Or is there really a dangerous situation? I want to bring to our attention that President Barack Obama designated a presidential commission for the study of bioethical issues to report on the ethics of synthetic biology and emerging technologies. And in May 2010, they concluded. The commission found, quotes, that synthetic biology offers extraordinary promise to create new products for clean energy, pollution control, and medicine, to revolutionize chemical production and manufacturing, and to create new economic opportunities. With this promise comes a duty to attend carefully to potential risks, be responsible stewards, and consider thoroughly the implications for humans, other species, nature, and the environment. Almost 10 years have already gone by. As recently stated by Teresa Phillips, Society Concerned with Biotechnology, in the Balanced Biotech Industry, July 25th, 2019, and I quote, "Besides the age-old debate over whether cloning genes is sacrilegious, innumerable ethical questions arise over the appropriateness of licensing genetic inventions and other IP issues." And I would like to add that this is also true for vaccines, biopharmaceuticals such as monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of some tumors, arthritis, applications of synthetic biology, and so on. So the question, how can we make affordable these results to all countries? Is this an ethical issue? And last, the advance in computer science and artificial intelligence and the use of data banks. How can we guarantee that information in these banks, such as medical histories, is going to be beneficial to society as a whole? Yuval Harari, Israeli historian and philosopher, last week attended a meeting in Brazil, in São Paulo, some weeks ago, where he presented an impressive panel on the future of humanity, pointing to ecological collapse, the return to war, and technological disruption. In the 21st century, the greatest struggle of mankind, according to his point of view, is against being irrelevant due to AI revolution. This revolution can create unprecedented inequalities, not only between people, but also between different countries. But what will human life mean when all decisions are made by an algorithm? We have no, according to him, we have no philosophical and existential models for understanding and interpreting such a life. Quote, politicians can create heaven or hell. We philosophers are dealing with the difficulty of conceptualizing what will be heaven and what will be hell. If we fail in these utopias, we'll find ourselves trapped inside them with no way out. And the disruption will not only be about economics, politics, or philosophy, but biology as well. Finally, these are emerging ethical dilemmas in science and technology. They are few but important, and they set limits to our science and cannot simply be reduced to issues of economics and ideology. Altogether, we have to tackle these issues in order to properly answer the question if there are ethical limits to what science can achieve or should pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nader, for this inspiring presentation. We turn now to our third speaker for today morning, and this is Kirsty Lonne. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo, Norway. She has interests at the crossroad of international politics, law, and sociology, has expertise across the sectors of international justice, humanitarianism, and human rights. She is studying the promises and pitfalls of using technology to prevent, mitigate, treat, and punish global violence and the ethical challenges they engender. She is among a few international scholars who have been granted access to the US base of Guantanamo in Cuba. She is particularly interested in understanding how international human rights NGOs have influenced the meaning of punishment at a global level and have influenced ideas of global justice. Kirsty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver, for that long and nice introduction. Now, first of all, let me start by saying how honored I am to be able to address such a distinguished assembly, and on the most critical yet precarious of topics, namely the role of ethics or ethical limits to the scientific pursuit. As is the privilege of academics and the young, I will, as a representative from the Young Academy of Norway, offer critique, or at least, I hope, some pause for thought. But when I sat down to think about what to say today, I couldn't help but feel sort of intellectually stuck in three paradoxes. Paradoxes that I think animate our condition today, and that I take as point of departure for my talk. Now first, and that we've already heard a great deal about, alongside this unprecedented potential of science and technology to solve complex global challenges is the perpetual threat of catastrophe. From the atomic bomb to chemical, biological, robotic warfare, to genome editing, data-driven political elections, to artificial intelligence, the foundations of civilization as we know it are on the balance. There may be rupture ahead, a future unknown to us. And at the same time, there is profound faith in this technologized solutions to almost everything, representing a form of technological utopianism. Second, and relatedly, there is widespread populist pushback and contestation against the universality of science, as we've heard. The very idea of truth is up for grabs, certainly in some circles, and expertise, including that of scientists, is not the same as power. The international order is once more one of increased political turmoil and instability, and one where scientific and technological advancement carry the potential of facilitating democratic participation as well as undermining it altogether. Key word here being Cambridge Analytica and the referendums in Kenya, UK with Brexit, and US with Trump. Three, or come to think about it, my third point may be more of a problematique than a paradox. The Age of Enlightenment brought with it a profound faith in the progress of reason, science, and technology. However, a question must be asked about whether we have a similar faith in the progress of morals, of values, of ethics. In other words, can we expect the parallel progress of ethics alongside scientific progress? If the answer to this is yes, we might just as well lean back, or better go home and be confident in our overarching faith in humanity's inevitable progress, morally as well as scientifically. If not, however, if we are a little bit unsure about this, we better roll up our sleeves and claim our agency as science and scientists and scholars that should have a say in the development of science and the role of ethics herein. And in the remainder of my talk, I will take issue with the agency of scientists. And I will draw on insights, as we heard, from my research on political violence and international criminal justice, including the use of technology to prevent, mitigate, treat, and punish global violence. And then I'll briefly address some of the structural challenges also embedded in our industry, and how, especially for young researchers, these challenges may also play into today's discussion. In short, I will question whether we, scientists and scholars, are really the one calling the shots when it comes to setting limits to science. Answering this in the negative, I will therefore end by making a call for the scientific community to reclaim their ethical agency and to see ethics as part and parcel of the scientific ethos. So now, the Enlightenment brought with it not only a profound faith in scientific reason, but also in the sanctity of the individual, of the human, that we possess some innate and inalienable rights simply because we exist. The modern human rights movement finds its origins here, with rules for warfare, for governance, for how kings and other sovereigns can legitimately treat their citizens, and even hold these leaders criminally accountable if they violate these norms. Albeit human rights still often exist more in theory than in practice, the past century has witnessed a decrease in human suffering, violence, and war, if we accept the parameters of measurement, relative poverty, and death caused by violent conflict. So to some extent, maybe, scientific and moral progress correlate. With that said, though, it seems science is no restraint to violence. In fact, throughout modern history, we know the contrary to be the case. The application of science and the pursuit of science through and for violent means. I need only mention the Second World War to this audience and remind ourselves that Germany was considered at the forefront of the scientific and technologically advanced human civilization, but that this position in no way offered any limitation to the inhumanity that followed. In fact, scholars of mass violence point to how modern technology facilitated and exacerbated the scope and scale of the Holocaust. The number of killings alone would simply not have been possible without the emergence of the industrial and technocratic state. I'm not making a direct parallel to the role of science and scientists in the Third Reich, but in my research on contemporary political violence, scientists and scholars certainly do play a role. Science become part of power struggles. In the US-led global war on terror, and especially in the CIA's counterterrorism program after 9/11, psychologists and lawyers alike facilitated and legitimated the use of torture. Contracted psychologists designed, implemented, and oversaw the agency's torture program, while lawyers in the US administration engaged in an expansive and experimental legal interpretation that, in their view, legalized the use of interrogation techniques otherwise known as torture. Now, this is far from a unique case. The application of national scientific and legal expertise legitimated and legalized action considered not only gravely unethical, but also manifestly unlawful by international standards, including the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of punishment. In hindsight, or from a distance, these ethical limits were clearly crossed. But up close and in the everyday, ethical boundaries are often much more blurry. It may also be difficult to distinguish between what is and what ought. As with the title here, what can science achieve and what should science achieve are two fundamentally different questions. And I think it is imperative to be aware of it. In my previous research on drones and warfare, the lack of distinction, or conflation of argument really, between technical ability and moral judgment is part of the problem. For example, there is an idea that more precise weapons technology is humanizing warfare. Among supporters, drones are often represented as a humanitarian alternative to troop deployments, and thus a step forward in humanitarian technology. By being able to selectively eliminate targets to kill with surgical precision, the use of armed drones paradoxically paves the way for drone strikes and extrajudicial killings to avoid being labeled as actual warfare. It thereby potentially lowers the threshold for the use of force. In other words, the perceived technical ability to effectively kill designated individuals risks becoming the very rationale for doing so. Instead of humanizing warfare, war becomes borderless, everywhere, perpetual. Now, while I have talked about hard politics, muscular state power, we are all aware that our industry, though, as other industries, are subject to political contestation and to the realities of professionalism, finance, and politics. Science and scientists do not operate in a vacuum. They are not outside the realms of big power politics, nor the subtle power dynamics that characterize us as human beings. It is something that we in the young academies are well aware. Ethics and limits also concern how we treat one another. It is naive to think that working conditions characterized by short-term fixed contracts, yet significant publication pressures, informal and formal hierarchies, and vulnerability to sexual harassment and mental health issues and burnouts, that such conditions do not themselves set limits to the pursuit of science. Ethical limits to what science can achieve is also an issue that demands a fair amount of introspection within our research communities. How do we structure them to enable young, talented scientists to thrive and pursue? And what more, how do we make sure that the generation of scientists to come are fit to the task and fit to actually reflect on the ethical limitations of their pursuits? When it comes to discussions on research integrity and the independence of science, the discussion often turns to whether science and technology are in themselves neutral, and if it is only the application of science and technology that can be put to use for violent, harmful, or otherwise unethical means. It is a discussion that presumes essentially a clear-cut distinction between pure and applied science. However, this distinction is one of emphasis and not mutual exclusion. There is also, or related to this, there is ever more focus on external funding. For young researchers, being able to bring in grants is tantamount to showcasing their excellence. Some grants are even so prestigious that they function as sort of a golden ticket to tenure. In Norway, almost all funding schemes are linked to societal relevance and many to user involvement often being synonymous with powerful industry sectors. What is more, in the university sector, there is now just as many, if not more, staff in administrative positions than in research. So these developments not only beg the question of how pure science is, but if at all, it is us that call the shots, especially, perhaps, when it comes to ethics. Now, the five of us, the people in this room, can discuss this topic, but how much do we, the scientists and scholars, really decide on these issues? Because there is a trend in the EU, at least, towards increasing bureaucratization and judicialization or legalization of research ethics. For example, there is an emerging discussion in the Norwegian Academy whether the newly implemented research ethics law actually appropriates or steals the power to decide on, well, whether the science project is ethical or not. The discussion is now on whether ethics are more and more put into the hands of the ever-growing university administrators, research managers, and lawyers hired to respond to the legalization of research ethics. It reflects a development where law takes over ethics, and as such, the actual assessment of what is and what is not ethical scientific practice. We also see this in examples of how ethical guidelines now are treated sometimes as if they have legal content, and thus potentially they are treated as potential violations of contract. So basically the question, is this ethical, is replaced with, have you followed the rules? Have you ticked up the boxes? Out the window goes the actual ethical consideration, discussion, and reflection, the discursive space where scientists and scholars reflect on what is right and what is wrong, and not the least, where are the limits of the scientific pursuit. To conclude, I want to reiterate my gratefulness for the opportunity to address this honorable assembly and to be a voice of concern for the greatest of challenges that is bestowed upon that of science and those fortunate enough to pursue it, namely the wisdom of restraint and slow ethical reflection. Because to me, it seems that ethics and science move by different speeds. They operate in different temporalities. I hope that I'm wrong, but to end then, my question for you is, can we expect a parallel progress in ethics alongside scientific progress? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll ask you for a small memory experiment, because my mistake, I forgot to ask Helena Nader a question to you. So we'll start with we will have the two in a row, but we will start with Kirsty Loney question on Slido, which I ask my colleagues to put on the screen. Yes, can we expect a parallel progress of ethics alongside scientific progress? So I'll leave you the first 5 minutes to answer this one, and then we will put on the screen Helena Nader's question. So please try to rewind what you've heard before and answer Helena Nader's question just after this one. Right. And while you do this, let me present you the last speaker of the morning. This is Tarone Grandison. He's the chairman of the board of the Data Driven Institute, which is a public health nonprofit that helps policymakers create and implement effective programs and policies to solve their most critical problems. All of this, of course, by using the knowledge of the community, data, and technology. He has over 25 years experience in software engineering, security, and privacy. He ended his studies with a PhD degree in computer science from Imperial College of Science in London. He was the Deputy Chief Data Officer of the US Department of Commerce and also advises the government of Jamaica on its information technology strategy. Taron Grandison, floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It warms my heart to know that so many of the panelists are on the same track and are saying the same thing. So expect the same message from me as well. The question itself is very difficult. And as a computer and data scientist and researcher, my first task is always to break the problem down into its most basic elements and then to clearly define any terms or concepts that may be open to interpretation. So, like Christy said before, the prompt is essentially two questions in my viewpoint. It is, are there ethical limits to what science can achieve? And are there ethical limits to what science should pursue? If we break it down even further, we see that the term ethical here needs to be defined, especially for somebody who's not an ethicist. I'm a computer scientist and data scientist. And every single person here probably has a differing interpretation of what it is. So for me, ethics and ethical behavior at the core is the application of moral principles in a given situation. And now we've just added an extra term, morals, moral principles. And morals refers to the standards of behavior based upon the principles of right and wrong. And I'm not going to go into what right and wrong are. Right? So now the prompt, or the questions in the prompt become, are there situations where the principles of right and wrong limit what science can achieve? Are there situations where the principles of right and wrong limit what science should pursue? And these two questions are more tractable to me than the initial prompt. So the problem then is, how do I create a framework where I can actually evaluate this? Now, with my work across industries and sectors over the last decade, it's highlighted to me that the ethical nature of any computing or data solution, as Christy pointed out earlier, is built upon two things: the ecosystem in which they're developed and the intent or the purpose for which they're being used or applied. When we talk about ecosystem and speaking about what are the business, legal, technology, and societal factors that bring about the creation of these discoveries and advances, more importantly, I'm referring to the dominant factor or factors that produce scientific innovations. Let me give you an example. How many people here, by show of hands, have heard of Thomas Jefferson? Okay, more than expected for Europe. That's awesome. Jefferson is one of the founding fathers of the American experiment. He's known for writing the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the founding documents. He's lesser known for writing this document called the Notes on the State of Virginia, which was a response to France on how well Virginia was actually doing, where he purported the inferiority of blacks. And I quote, "I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in their endowments both of body and mind." Now, this document led to the alignment for 2 centuries of federal funding with medical exploration that led to a lot of the innovations that we take for granted today in the field. So the question I have for the audience here, was an ethical limit breached in this example? Should this avenue of investigation been explored at all, given that it was based upon this particular document and this particular perspective? Another example on your right is the HeLa cell, which is the only human cell that survives in vitro And it's the basis for vaccines, right? For vaccines for polio, for HPV. It's basically the foundation for gene mapping. It's fundamental for most work that we actually see right now, most work that actually gets awarded at the Nobel level. But very few people understand the origin story of the HeLa cell. And it goes back to 1951 when a 31-year-old African-American woman called Henrietta Lacks had cancer, went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. They took a culture, they reused it without her consent, and for 2 decades they hid the story and said it was from a fictional character called Helen Lane. Here we had the factor of business creating an ecosystem that drove science. With Thomas Jefferson, we had the factor of business and the legal realm. Again, in this case, was there an ethical breach that occurred? Is all the medical research and the innovations on vaccines and gene mapping, are those areas of investigations that we should pursue based upon the ethics of this scenario? When it comes to the second dimension in my framework for evaluation, intent of application, what do I mean by that? I mean, how is the science used? What is the domain that the science is actually being developed for? And what is the domain that is actually being developed in? I'm talking about the possible consequences of science before we even begin the exploration process. As mentioned before, you can think of the example from physics, the hydrogen bomb. In that case, was there an ethical limit that would actually breach there? Should we have actually explored that particular range? In my particular field, as everyone has mentioned before, it's artificial intelligence, and particularly it's machine learning. And machine learning is just the application of statistical algorithms on data by some practitioner to give you some insight. But the insight could be amazing. You could have machine learning being used to detect cardiac arrhythmia. You could have it being used to help people regain control of their limbs. You could also use it to help diagnose more effectively eye disease and many other diseases. As pointed out earlier, you could also use it to influence the outcomes of elections and referendum. This picture is of Alexander Nix. Who knows who Alexander Nix is, by show of hands? One person, okay, two, that's perfect. So Alexander Nix is the former CEO of Cambridge Analytica. And Cambridge Analytica became famous for the use of Facebook data, again, machine learning, clustering of many different dimensions on individuals to get different categorizations of people and figuring out how to effectively target them or outreach to them. And Cambridge Analytica did amazing things in over 100 countries across 5 different continents, everywhere from Trinidad and Tobago, India, the United Kingdom, Malta, Mexico, Australia. And it's the same application, it's the same use of a core technology, machine learning. And we have to ask ourselves, in each one of these cases, is it ethical? Was a limit actually breached? And should machine learning, artificial intelligence in this case, be pursued for each one of these applications? So it brings me back to the core question and the struggle I had trying to figure out a way to answer it. So are there situations where the principles of right and wrong limit what science can achieve? And I had to say, technically, no. Because the science, the technology itself is neutral. It doesn't have any inherently good or bad qualities or attributes. The ethics appears when we examine the ecosystem that facilitates the science creation and when we evaluate how the science is to be used. When it comes to the second question, are there situations where the principles of right and wrong limit what science should pursue? Yes, definitely yes. We have centuries of examples that show this is the case. And if we don't actually heed and understand history, then we're doomed to repeat it. And when it comes to the original prompt of, are there ethical limits to what science can achieve and should pursue, as a good scientist, I'm going to say it depends. And with that, I thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grandison. So we will also ask you a question to the audience through Slido. There should be a question. This is the one. Do you think there are or should be ethical limits? No, that's the last one. Please come back one. There should be a question related to Mr. Grandison's talk. Well, while we are trying to find it, I kindly invite our speakers of the morning to join me on stage for the panel discussion that we will have. Please. Do we have the question?
Please. Care about the order?
No, I'll just sit here. Take a seat. So we will have this panel discussion with, in the first part, a few questions of mine, and then we will open the floor to questions as well. Maybe first question to all of you, and this brings us back to what we've heard. I was actually talking to a very special person in Switzerland who was a priest, then got to be a doctor, so resigned from the clergy, got to be a doctor, medical doctor, and now he's an ethican and director and science journalist, actually, heading a medical journal. And he told me that nowadays, ethics can often be seen as a constraint, a break to science, right? And he had this really nice metaphor of seeing maybe ethics intervening in the science process as the clergy did at the time when imposing decisions. So my general question is ethics the new church in a way by putting brakes or constraints to science? Or the next question maybe can be how to make ethics not a brake or a constraint to science, but something that drives the good science, the good part of science. So who wants to take this one? There are some mics on the table. Please push the button. There's a... Yes. Here you go.
Testing. Okay, perfect. So I don't think ethics are brakes to science per se. I think ethics is the new foundation to science and scientific discovery. And we need to figure out ways of making it a natural part of how do we do science. Figuring that out is, I guess, why we're all here and why we actually want to have this discussion.
But there's this impression that ethics come always too late in the game. So can it be really part of science, as you say?
I agree. It does come late in the game. It's the same discussion I've been having for 15 years when it comes to security and privacy, where it's viewed as a stamp at the very back or a check that you actually go through. How do we embed it all throughout or embed ethical considerations all throughout the process of doing science?
I agree completely. I think it's ethics is a result in a way. It now can be seen as a product of scientific experiments, and then new scientific experiments can be planned with what new ethics suggests result. Because ethics is a process rather than a Bible, written in stone. I think that new questions are generated as a result.
But at the same time, at the pace at which science is moving now, can ethics be part of the process when science is made, or will it always, be reflecting on science with one or two steps behind?
Well, I think this is a very important question, and I guess, that I would like to believe that we are moving towards a place where we are not all living and working in silos, and that ethics isn't, a distinct discipline where only those who have trained in ethics can actually be ethical or advise on ethical matters, and only those who have trained in science can understand science and its implications. I think we need to work hard to break down barriers, to expose both the public and our children in schools to issues that cross these domains, and we certainly in our own professional practices need to take that approach as well. I spoke about this in my remarks. It's something that really worries me because I hear too many scientists now saying, oh, well, the science is moving so quickly, how can we possibly address all the ethical and social issues that are emerging? How can we even anticipate what will come? Well, I think we're smarter than that, and we can do better. I think that there are examples where we do routinely embed an ethical perspective in the science we do, in the world of clinical research, in the world of drug and medical product development. From the very beginning of shaping the research agenda, there are points of ethical review, and studies are structured in a way that reflects not just the quality of the study, but also the ethics and the appropriateness of the approach. That isn't to say that it's perfect, and that isn't to say that many scientists don't view this as an impediment to progress and a drag on innovation. But I think, that it is one instance where there is a recognition that we are not operating in a total vacuum. But I think it's one of the things we need to work on. And one of the challenges that, I've been struggling with in co-chairing this WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing is we talk about the need for a broader social consensus on how this new technology should be applied. But how do you achieve social consensus? It's a dream, but it's a very great challenge to achieve.
We will come back on this, but first, I would like to rebound on the question asked by Kirsty, which showed that it was actually the most equilibrate question when you asked, can they move alongside, right? And the room was more or less 45, have the numbers, or let's say 50-50, right? So half of you disagree with this idea that it's possible for ethics to move alongside science. What is your view on this?
Well, as I said, then it's just, if it's that positive, we can all go home, because then it's just sort of determined that we'll be okay, I guess. But for the 50-something that aren't convinced by that, I think it, to go off from the last conversation here, ethics is, outside this room, ethics is often something, especially in teaching, that is boring. It's often the same as restraint, as limits. We talk about ethics as limiting the progress of science, instead of saying ethics as something that is ingrained in the scientific pursuit. And I think ethics must, as it is with many buzzwords, it needs to be mainstreamed. It is a culture, which means that it has to be it's not only a training aspect for PhD students or for master's students, it's also a training aspect for project leaders, for university director. It needs to be mainstream from top down. Also, vertically, to funders and to the public. What is research? What is research integrity? What can and cannot we as researchers actually do if we should maintain our research integrity? So ethics, even though it often seems to be boring, we need to find a way to make it part of the scientific ethos, to make it more part of what we are and who we are, and take more charge in these ethical debates as part of our vocation, really, I think. This was a long reply to your...
I give you the word, but I just want to, well, jump on your last remark. And this brings us to your point. Do different economical situations, models, constrain different ethical principles? And if I may enlarge the question, does the same ethics apply everywhere in the world? Or maybe in every field of science? Or even maybe in fundamental or practical science applications? Is that different? How far?
Yeah, the point is, what I believe is that should apply ethics everywhere. There shouldn't be difference. Nevertheless, we need to face reality. There is a difference. And I think it's different than moral. Moral, you have difference according to each society. But ethics should be the same. We are just one human species living on the same planet. That's why I asked that question. And I'm really concerned with that. Several years ago, when we start with clinical trials, there was a nice study performed, I think by Davison, I don't recall the year. And the results at the beginning of the clinical trials showed that there was a tendency for pharmaceutical financing experiments to have a tendency to say that that new drug was better than the other treatment. Now it's not anymore like that, or at least not as much as it used to be. So society is learning from ethics, and ethics is everywhere. It's not only an issue for scientists. I think that's my belief.
Mr. Granderson, I'd like to hear you on this, because your field of research is really concrete applications, right? Big data, computer science, etc.
I just wanted to comment on the discussion beforehand.
Okay.
So the task before not only the panelists here, but everyone that's sitting is, how do we actually change our organizations? How do we change the cultures that we have influence in? Right, we have a humongous, enormous change management challenge before us to figure out how do we actually make ethics hidden and fundamental and fun in everything that we're actually doing. And at the very core of it, it's about people, it's about processes, it's about technology. And anyone who's done anything change management knows that people are really difficult, right? And that's gonna be the crux of it.
I wanted also to add from, I agree, and I also wanted to add from the biological perspective that governments sometimes have different agendas than scientists in terms of ethics. They try to impose differences, taking into account religion, ethnicity, history, everything. It's in their interest to separate people. But we as scientists, we work towards creating the same agenda. And I was trying to do workshops in schools called genetics. So it's like a genetics, but with ethics in it, explaining that from biological point of view, we are designed to find partners across the border, because genetically we have this little heterozygosity, the mistakes like that are hidden in us. So if we find a mating partner far away, we have a less chance that our children will have health problems. And that is the way to unify, to understand. And this is, I think, is a way to build peace as well with science. And as you know, build a foundation for ethics for the global citizens of the future, that there is no wars because we are all the same.
Thank you. I think it's the right moment on this to open the floor to questions. We have two persons walking around with microphones, so please raise your hand. I see a first question at the very back there. Is there a second one so that we can already give you the mic? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Duano Campo. I'm Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Colombia.
Please put the mic closer. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a Colombian diplomat based here in Budapest, Duano Campo. I wish to congratulate the organizers and the excellent speakers. I want to share an opinion that it's more on a personal basis than as a representative of the Colombian government. I come from a country whose political constitution is secular, and we are very proud of that. The first question of the survey, though it was very important, lacked, to me, a fundamental element. Who will set the ethical limits to science? And I would feel very confident if those ethical limits were set by peer-to-peer review among scientists or deontological associations, but actually fear that very much in the sense of what Dr. Grandison said, those limits may be set by organized religions or political decision makers, and in that sense, very often too, by the disproportionate influence of those organized religions on decision makers. So my question would be, what is your opinion on who do you think actually sets those ethical limits? And that's for reality. And as a perspective, who do you think should set those ethical limits?
Who wants to take this one?
I think you alluded to the answer to your first question in your prelude. Currently, the ethical limits are set by the church, religious organizations, and the people that are in control. People that are in control, meaning the people that are, senior and in positions of power. Who should set it? It should be a collaboration of everyone that has a stake in society, right? So how do we actually get different perspectives from all the different stakeholders to say, what do we actually see as an ethical norm for us? And what do we see as something that we're not concerned about as a particular society? Whether it's on a country basis, whether it's by discipline or field. The problem is, how do you then facilitate or make that happen? Right? Because consensus is a very difficult thing to make happen.
And maybe the pace, because you have a point. I mean, but talking about CRISPR is a very complex issue. If you want to have the layman be involved in discussions, you start to lose time in the discussion towards the pace of the science progress.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. In the beginning, it used to be that scientists would set up the limits of the ethics, but we found out that's most necessary. The whole society, all stakeholders, discuss what are the limits of science. That's what I agree.
Thank you. I mean, you have asked a very, very challenging question, and the truth is that the world is a messy place, and there is no one clear decision maker, and there is no one clear model that has existed or will exist going forward. But I think in the context of what we're discussing this morning, what is clear is that we need to really recognize that there are many different components to how ultimately a meaningful governance framework will need to unfold. And importantly, I think for those of us in the room, the scientific community really has to step up to the plate and create a set of understood and agreed upon, formally or informally, ways of conducting science and means for responsible stewardship and oversight of science. And I think it's, I've seen it in so many domains of scientific work that if the scientific community steps forward and acknowledges the issues and their complexity, but begins to demonstrate an approach, that begins to lay down a framework that then other decision makers and leaders will respond to, rather than allowing the script to be written from the start by Congress or a parliamentary body or a church or religious community or an ideological sector or a political party. So at the end of the day, all those components and the public more broadly are going to be involved in determining pathways forward and the way in which some of this work goes forward. But I, in this context, really want to emphasize the important leadership role of the scientific community.
Let's take the second question, and then we have one just behind. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Nadim Adi from iCorsa. My idea is that a lot of the scientific breakthroughs came from scientists who, at a certain point, kind of ignored the ethics. The one that comes to mind most prominently is the person who developed the vaccine for smallpox. He kind of did the experiment on himself. And nowadays, when we mention the genetically engineered babies in China, isn't there always a very huge temptation for scientists to be, I want to be the first one who has done this and the first one who's achieved something? And in many cases, we will glorify in 100 years the persons who are successful, but if he's unsuccessful, well, everybody would jump on them and say, well, I told you so. But I'd like to know your thoughts on this, because it's something that's always a struggle for scientists.
Can I start? Well, you said something that's really true. And we can go to other examples. For instance, when scientists made all the discoveries regarding the atomic bomb, do you think the scientists wanted to drop the bomb in Japan? So humanity is always facing these dilemmas. And it depends on who is using and who is it's something that really I would love to have the answer, saying that no, now we are in control. Unfortunately, I don't believe that we are in control.
Just one quick response, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, and I certainly agree with what Helena just said. But this is where we need to really think about, in the most fundamental ways, how are we structuring our culture and community of science? And unfortunately, we reward scientists for breakthroughs, for being the first to do something, for having positive results. We don't reward people that come forward and say, this doesn't work, my experiment failed. We don't reward people that are doing important work that really takes someone else's discovery, but kind of does the tedious stuff that makes it possible to actually scale it up and make it into something that is applicable. Translational research never gets the rewards that fundamental research does, et cetera, and other things. So we need to really think about how in our academic settings and in our industry science we reward scientists and scientific work to make sure that we also are ensuring the adequate balance and perspective, and that also we need to start rewarding studies that reflect a careful thinking through of the appropriateness of the research, the possible unintended consequences, and we need to bring in science funders and science publishers as part of this broader discussion as well. We had two remarks, maybe Tyron and then Kirsty.
No? Thank you for the question. Very provocative. I think there's an elephant in the room here that we have to recognize, that the scientific community right now, the way it is competitive, yes? Yeah. And it's ego-driven, right?
What is the second
Competition
point? What is the second point?
Is ego-driven, right? And what we're seeing right now is that there has to be a move towards being collaborative and building communities.
So how to set this move?
No, that's the question to you. So how do we get there? And it points out to me the dangers in having the current evolution of the scientific community view themselves as leaders in ethics and how we need to change that discussion into how do we have the scientific community be facilitators for communities to move the ethics discussion, the ethics standards, the ethics evolution forward.
So we have one question here and then one just behind the participant. Yes, please. And then here. And, okay, I will come to you.
Jan Helge Solbakk, Professor of Medical Ethics, Oslo University. I wonder if we look at the history of research, science and technology development, I think it would be difficult to conclude that scientific literacy means that you also are in the position of normative literacy. Harry Martinson was a Swedish poet. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think in 1964. In a huge poem entitled Aniara, he has a fantastic phrase which I think is important for the scientific community to take into consideration. He says, "My friend, you know too much without ever having thought about it." I share the view that scientists should also have a role in the development of the ethical part of doing science. But I'm scared when I hear that scientists should take a leadership role. Scientists know science, but they do not know anything more than any other citizens in the world about the normative and value aspects of science. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give the microphone just behind you. Just behind you. Yeah. And we have another question here.
Thank you.
Wait, we had another question here, and then I'll come to you. Please.
I agree with your statement.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. So this issue of ethics, many countries, culture, how do we deal with it? But after the Second World War, and with what happened in the war, humanity passed the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is very central. As Europe was working on the issue related to the directive on data protection, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was at the center of that. The issue of privacy, data protection, my data, manipulating my data, taking my data from the internet and using it for other purposes. So it's not about which particular country, which particular culture, but we have already decided 70 years ago about that. So I think that that text should be able to guide us as a global community as we deal with this issue.
Thank you very much. Is there a comment? Yeah, two comments.
First comment, so to Christie's presentation, it's been amazing the progress and the discussion around human rights and data. But what we've seen, 70 years on is a lot of great theory, very little application and very little in practice. So we need to have the discussion around, yes, we can talk about, what the privacy principles are. We can talk about what your human right mandates are supposed to be. But how do we actually get it to the point where the entire society is enforcing it? Right? And I don't think we're actually there at this point yet.
Thank you. So human rights are also an ethical framework, right? But in terms of this, we're having these discussions now in relation to the GDPR, actually, and data protection. And we're having a lot of conversations at the same time here. We talk about science as if it is one thing. It's not always. There's many different disciplines. There is very, very many different epistemologies of what science is, what it should be. And we need also to talk about these issues, right? So what happens to using data for only one purpose and having explicit legal consent or written consent? How does that impact the methodology of ethnography, for instance, right? We're also having discussions on whether you can use judgments as data and how they are impacted by these forms of new legal frameworks. So these discussions that we're having on ethics and taking responsibility and that should be have. Obviously, that should be had, but we also need to have discussions of how these processes impact the direction of science. What happens to history and to research on dead people that have not given their explicit consent? What happens to cultural studies with these forms of ethical and now legal formulations? So these are also discussions that we need to be having, I think.
I'll take further questions if you don't mind. Yes, please stand up.
My name is Thierry Courvoisier and I'm an astrophysicist. Actually, nobody can limit what I think, and that applies to everybody around here. So we can talk about ethical limits or whatever, just doesn't apply. Where it applies is at the means and the support that I get to do what I want to do. So the limits are applied in the funding system. And then we jump directly into the question of legalization and these sorts of questions that were mentioned before. But they're not my questions, in a way, as a researcher. And I think we should also not forget that about 2/3 of the research is made behind private walls in industry. And there, the limits are those of business, nothing more. So the ethics that applies there, or that should apply there, is the ethic of business. So I think that we are actually in a domain where we're not so much talking about the scientists, but we're talking about the systems that fund the scientists, be they public or be they private, and the limits that society wants to apply there. But again, I can do whatever I want.
Thank you. We take a very last questions. I'm sorry for all the questions that remain in the room, but we run out of time. And the last questions comes from
Yes, hello. I'm Clarissa Rios from Peru. And the feeling I have is that we can spend hours and for us talking about ethics. So I was wondering if perhaps the World Science Forum could be a place where we can make ourselves accountable. And I invite this panel, I think we have the editor of Nature here as well, to write a paper, not about what are the problems, but about what are the best practices. What has worked, what hasn't worked around the world, what are recommendations, why at the curricula in universities we don't have part of the curricula that invite us to go to organizations like PETA, to talk about animal rights, to have a little bit more of ideas about that. Why, if I have studied biomedicine, I have never had a course that put me in contact with patients, with my subjects of study. Perhaps that would have gave me a little bit more idea and a little bit more of ethics while I was growing up as a scientist. Thank you.
Is there a comment on this? So I think it's going to be the final word. I will give some conclusions words. So we have heard our speakers, and I think they have shown that in their respective fields, ethics play a big role, but that maybe this concept is understood in different ways and sets different limits, what it does. And maybe in other cases that ethics has to constantly move alongside scientific discoveries, and therefore ethical guidelines have to also be constantly renewed. And with this in mind, I ask you again this question, the same one as the very first one you had to answer on Slido. So we'll see if the panels, the lecture has changed your mind. So please do answer the same question as you did 2 hours ago. Are there ethical limits to what science should achieve or can achieve or should pursue? There was a okay. There was an 85% yes at the very beginning, so we will wait for the numbers to appear, but it seems like it's pretty much the same now. And while waiting for the numbers, I'll just leave you, we started with Denis Gabor, and I'll just leave you with two quotes from the Nobel Prize of Physics in '71. He said those two quotes, he's famous for quotes, but for those two actually. The future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. It was man's ability to invent which has made society what it is. This is the first one. And the second one is, till now, man has been up against nature. From now on, he will be up against his own nature. I think those two quotes fit quite well in the debate. It's the occasion for me to thank our 5 panelists very warmly for their presence and presentation, and wish you a very nice day. Thank you very much.